Welcome to the summer series of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In this final episode of our summer series, you will hear from three presenters at our 2024 conference. The first is Dr. Charles Richardson on Menzies' philosophical legacy to his party. The second is Senator Stephen Loosley on A Horse with No Name, Federal Labor 1954 to 66. The final paper is by Professor Frank Bongiorno on one of the world's masterpieces, Australia's reaction to Menzies' retirement, January 1966.
Thank you, Zach. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We've heard a lot at this conference, and for that matter, its predecessors, about Menzies' record in government, but surprisingly little about the vehicle through which he achieved and retained government, and which, at least in part, was his creation, namely the Liberal Party of Australia. We could talk about various aspects of the party, its organisation, its electoral performance, its personnel, but my training is as a philosopher, so I plan to focus mainly on its philosophy. And as the founding leader of the Liberal Party, Robert Menzies must be credited with a major share of responsibility for its condition at the time of his retirement. In this paper, I want to examine the philosophical state in which his departure left the party and inquire into the effect that the nature of that leadership had on the way that the party developed in succeeding years. It's a big topic, so some of this will be a bit sort of loose and impressionistic. There'll be more detail in the published version, and I urge you to read that when it appears. Earlier, non-Labor parties in Australia, like their British models, had originated from the parliamentary party rather than from any outside movement. Traditional classification of parties into mass or elite-based, they were elite parties. So they emphasised parliamentary independence from the non-parliamentary organisation. And they contrasted themselves in that respect with the Labor Party and its caucus system. The formation of the Liberal Party to some extent represented a departure from this practice. It was constituted by its members, not by its parliamentarians. But in fact, the break with non-Labor tradition was apparent rather than real. The parliamentarians remained the drivers of the party, independent both from the organisational wing and from caucus control. It was entirely appropriate that Menzies, as the major force behind the new party, was himself a parliamentarian. It's hard to imagine it happening any other way. Menzies envisaged the Liberal Party as based on a mass membership, but the effect of its traditions and of the somewhat non-ideological climate of the time meant that the party's direction was still mostly set by its leaders. Gerard Henderson, when writing the Liberal Party's history in the 1990s, elicited the following assessment from the then leader, Alexander Downer. Menzies, Downer said, was, I think, somebody who saw the Liberal Party as a party of power, not a party of ideology. And he worked very hard on both getting into power and staying in power. And in that context, he was pragmatic. He was happy to steal policies from the Labor Party. He was happy to change the party's position on things if he felt that that was going to guarantee the party remained in office. Henderson comments, rightly, I think, that this is somewhat harsh, but Downer apparently didn't see it that way. For him and for many members, the freedom from ideological depth or seriousness that they shared with Menzies was nothing to be ashamed of. That's not to suggest that Menzies' liberalism wasn't genuine. I think he was someone in whom respect for basic liberal values was very strong, but he was too much the politician not to be willing to tamper with them when it suited him. And his liberalism lay on top of a conservatism in temperament that ran very deep. The liberalism was attested even before the founding of the Liberal Party in 1943 by newspaper tycoon Warwick Fairfax, who said, Mr. Menzies is both a Liberal and a Democrat. In times when all political parties are more anxious to look after the interests of those supporting them than to maintain liberty and democracy in doing so, this is important. You might think that a newspaper proprietor's interpretation of liberty and democracy would not be entirely objective, but a remarkably similar assessment was made after Menzies' retirement by Jim Cairns, leader of Labor's left wing, later Deputy Prime Minister, who said, I believe he was a man of principle, that he valued liberty under the law, the kind of liberty the law has established, but is a regulated kind of liberty. I think he valued this very highly. The Liberal Party really was the Conservative Party of Australian politics, and here we had a man who had a lot of liberalism about him, posing as a Liberal in a Conservative party. Characteristic of Menzies' tenure also was the increased emphasis on the individual leader of the parliamentary party. To some extent, that's a matter of degree. Liberal leadership had always been important on the non-Labor side, but Menzies came to overshadow his colleagues to a greater extent. He had the prestige of being the party's founder and the sole survivor from the wreck of the United Australia Party, validated by then continued electoral success. And this had sometimes unfortunate effects on his subordinates, as Enid Lyons remarked that few who worked under him were able to reach their full stature. And the longer he stayed, the more Menzies eclipsed his colleagues. They thought, whether rightly or not, that he wanted yes men, so that tended to be what he got. And having the same leader for so long helped to entrench the leader principle in the Liberal Party. But Menzies shouldn't shoulder all of the blame for that. He was no dictator. He was constantly alert to electoral considerations and to pressures coming from within his own support base. His fate was always in his party's hands. Its subservience to him and then to his rather less worthy successors was a matter of its own choice. Both then and since, there was a perception in some circles that Menzies was jealous of potential rivals. I'll again refer to Gerard Henderson, who after casting a critical eye over the leading talents of the Menzies governments, said that it's nothing but a myth to maintain that Menzies was jealous of talent and got rid of all rivals. There were no real rivals. But Henderson goes on to acknowledge that Menzies failed to seek out such talent as there was and to reward it appropriately, producing a shortage of talent in the party's middle ranks. He preferred old and familiar faces. Prior to his final term, almost all of his ministerial appointments were men who'd been elected in 1949 or earlier. Of those who won seats in 1955, Fred Chaney and Bill Snedden, for example, got jobs only in 1964. Malcolm Fraser, who we'll talk about a bit later, had to wait until after Menzies' departure. And with his longevity in office and the gradual disappearance of other figures who might have competed with him in seniority, Menzies became strongly identified with the party. He never anointed a successor, but by the mid-1960s, Harold Holt, who'd been deputy leader for almost a decade, was clearly established as heir presumptive, and in 1966 he was elected unopposed as leader. Perhaps Menzies should have done more to prepare the party for life without him. Several observers pointed out at the time that his retirement threatened trouble for a party that had been a bit of a one-man band. But the truth was that replacing Menzies was not a simple matter. Despite his success, the system didn't run by itself. It required real political skill. And a lot had changed in the intervening 20 years. The era excuse me, the era of ideologically charged contest that had marked the 1940s had been replaced by a calmer time, captured by Daniel Bell's famous phrase, the end of ideology. In the 1950s, there was little intellectual criticism of prevailing political trends, either in Australia or overseas. The death of political philosophy was widely proclaimed. Democracy had won the war, at least in the West. No one wanted to inquire too closely into its theoretical health. But then in the 1960s, as Menzies neared retirement, the pendulum was swinging back again towards an era of more ideological conflict, of a sort that the post-Menzies Liberal Party was poorly equipped to cope with. Intellectual currents were coming to favour ideological debate. There were signs of the resuscitation of political philosophy. John Rawls's seminal paper, Justice as Fairness, appeared in 1958. Friedrich Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, 1960. Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. 1964, the candidacy of Barry Goldwater for president in the US marked the arrival of a new brand, so-called, of conservatism. Australia was a bit of an intellectual backwater in those days. Not much was heard here of these trends until the Fraser years, but a climate of intellectual ferment was gradually building up. Another effect of the sway that Menzies had over the Liberal Party was that no real factional system had developed in his time. There were broad philosophical tendencies, already apparent, but it wasn't until after his departure that you really see factions again in the party. Maybe they would have developed anyway, even if Menzies had still been there, due to the changing intellectual climate. But the party always felt apologetic about its factions. They were never rigid or formalised the way they were in the ALP. Nonetheless, from 1970 onwards, there's an undeniable presence of factions arising from a series of developments. I've got a few paragraphs there explaining those developments, but I'm going to skip over there. There was a left wing, which at the federal level defended John Gorton in the 60s and his legacy, and there was a right wing, which gave at least rhetorical support to the federal system and the market economy. However, it should be stressed that the left and right did not match up neatly to a philosophical division between liberal and conservative, or to any particular policy positions. The Dries, for example, who emerged in the later Fraser period, were never a faction, and their policies cut across the established left-right factional division. How are we going for time? Yeah, good. Both sides in the party paid lip service to the example of Menzies, but there were substantial differences in their attitude. The right saw Menzies, perhaps not entirely correctly, as one of themselves, and they used his name with greater enthusiasm. The left was much less keen on the causes that Menzies stood for in the public imagination, notably the monarchy, white Australia, a strong defence posture, and a close relationship with the Country Party. But the left could also call rhetorically on his support in some areas, starting with his frequently quoted explanation of the name adopted by the party. And if you were in the Liberal Party in the 70s or 80s, you would have heard this a lot. We took the name Liberal because we were determined to be a progressive party, willing to make experiments, in no sense reactionary, but believing in the individual, his rights, and his enterprise. There's no doubt about the genuineness of this sentiment, but it would be wrong to interpret it, as some might have hoped, as a declaration of war on conservatism, however understood. What party members really wanted was another Menzies, someone who would transcend factions and transcend ideology. Their search for that leader led to an emphasis on personalities and a comparative neglect of the policy debate. So when the party argued among itself, as it often did, as all parties do, it argued more about personality than about policy, and personal arguments as a result became more destructive. That's a general statement. I want to conclude by saying something more specific about the two most successful post-Menzies leaders, Malcolm Fraser and John Howard. Over time, they became bitter rivals for the mantle of Menzies, because each had a good claim to be seen that way. They differed in part because they stood on opposite sides of the ideological upheaval of the 1980s. After the leadership instability of the late 1960s and early 1970s, when 4 federal leaders came and went in 9 years, Malcolm Fraser became the new standard bearer for the right. Nostalgia grew for the Menzies era of strong, stable, and successful leadership, and Fraser seemed to fit the bill. Tall, somewhat aloof, intellectually gifted, of the right but not an extremist, he set out deliberately to reprise the Menzies role. Bob Santamaria said that he visibly represented the social values that Menzies himself had encapsulated. Fraser stood out in the Liberal Party as a man of real, if idiosyncratic talent. Paul Kelly called him a prime minister of complexity, turbulence, and patience, cumbersome but lethal. But what stands out is his close adherence to the Menzies tradition. He was able to proceed to some extent as if the Menzies era had never ended. And his prime ministership, I would say, showed both the strengths and the weaknesses of that approach. As he evidently realised, what most of the party's supporters wanted was to pretend that the previous 10 years just hadn't happened. 20 years after Fraser had become leader, John Howard returned to the position with broadly the same objective. He too wanted to return to the Menzies era, an era of strong leadership, moderate conservatism, steady as she goes administration. As Michelle Grattan says, Menzies was for him a sort of political benchmark. In fact, Howard went on to write, in his retirement, to write rather a good biography of Menzies. There were differences. He wasn't tall and patrician like Fraser. On the other hand, he was mad about cricket like Menzies. A class barrier separated him from Fraser, and in time an ideological barrier as well, but they both shared Menzies' fundamental approach to politics. Like Menzies, Howard saw himself as having been forged in the fires of opposition. He'd even had, like him, an earlier unsuccessful period of leadership and had learnt from his mistakes. Geoffrey Blaney yesterday had a nice line, "The wilderness reshaped him." And like Fraser, Howard came to the leadership after a long period of instability for which he himself was partly responsible. But as compared to Fraser, Howard stood on the wrong side of the watershed of the 1980s, in which Hawke and Keating had comprehensively dismantled the Australian settlement, had opened up the Australian economy and rearranged the philosophical landscape of Australian politics. Fraser had been able to proceed, as I said, to some extent as if the Menzies era had never ended. For Howard, that was not an option. The changes that Hawke and Keating had ushered in had been too great. If the glory days of the Menzies era were to return, they would have to be consciously recreated. And at one level, Howard knew that was impossible. Economic reform and Asian immigration could be halted, but they couldn't be reversed. The clock couldn't be put back. On some matters, Howard wanted to press reform further. Certainly some of his colleagues, I think 2 of whom are with us today, did want to go further. But he had to pretend that you could stand still. He had to pretend that that relaxed and comfortable Australia, to quote his famous line, could be recreated. Fraser at one point said of Howard, and it's cruel but not entirely unfair, he can't state an objective about the future because his objective is to lead us back to the 1950s. That attempt led the Liberal Party into some dark and dangerous waters, and what ultimately emerged, I would argue, contrary to Howard's wishes, was a very different party from the one that Menzies led. But rather than get us into present-day controversies, I think we should perhaps stop there.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the invitation to speak at the conference. Sir Robert would have been very pleased, my son and Nick, and I were in the Optus Stadium for the first cricket test Australia v India. And of course, we were elated after the first morning session where our bowlers demolished the Indian batting order. Later the same day, of course, India destroyed the Australian batting order. But Sir Robert would have been pleased. The title of my topic is A Horse with No Name, taken from the song talking about being in the desert. And Zach talked about Labor's lengthy period in the wilderness, most of it self-inflicted. And I want to begin with a very brief tale that I think illustrates the problem more than adequately, certainly between 1949 and 1969. Some might say 1972. Consider this, ladies and gentlemen. It's March of 1963 in Canberra, the Kingston Hotel. People, I see David nodding here, people would recall the special federal conference of the ALP called to debate the issue of whether or not the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party would support Garfield Barwick's proposition on the United States opening a communications facility on the Northwest Cape in WA. Now, in those days, of course, and through until the Whitlam ascendancy, the federal conference and in its absence, the federal executive of the Labor Party held sway on matters of platform, held sway in terms of interpretation. Now, the debate was held behind closed doors. An enterprising journalist who'd been a long time member of the ALP, Alan Reid, the Red Fox, was watching from afar and then decided to go across from Parliament House to the Kingston Hotel with a clutch of journalists who were already there. Now, Bob Carr once described Alan Reid to me as a supporter of Scullin Labor, but he actually was an active ALP member until the late 50s. He enjoyed good relations with most people on both sides of the aisle, not so much Menzies and certainly not Corwell, but overall he had some extraordinary sources, right down to Deputy Prime Minister for Gough Whitlam, Lance Barnard, continuing to be a source in the 1970s. So we're there in the early morning hours, about 2 a.m, the fourth day of the special federal conference, and Reid asks, is there anything happening outside the hotel? And is told, well, you'll see the federal leader, Arthur Corwell, and his deputy, Gough Whitlam, waiting outside to see what the conference is going to decide. Now, Reid immediately saw the opportunity, and he spoke to a taxi driver whom he knew, named Val, who was a part-time photographer, sent him home to get his camera and asked him to take photos of Messrs. Corwell and Whitlam outside the hotel in the streetlight. It didn't appear on the front page of the Daily Telly because of the time factor until the day after. But it illustrated with a very sharp point the fact that the federal ALP was dominated by faceless men. Now, it's not actually true in the sense of one of the delegates to the conference was a woman from Tasmania, Mrs. Phyllis Benjamin. But the theme stuck, and the theme stuck into the 1963 election. In 1961, of course, the credit squeeze election, where Harold Holt had his way, and Sir David Crawford lost the argument about imports, had seen the Menzies government reduced to an effective majority of one. after election of the Speaker. What I always enjoyed was Jim Killen's invention of the Menzies congratulatory telegram, "Killen, you are magnificent," which never existed. But Killen was like that. Now, Labor had misread in 1963 the reasons it had gone so close in 1961. It's true that the special ALP conference of March 63 had endorsed the federal parliamentary party's view that the North West Cape should proceed by one vote. Jack Duggan, the Queensland Labor leader, had rallied to Cornwall and Whitlam. But by 1963, other issues were on the agenda. And it's here again that federal Labor's ideological rigidity caused stumbles in the way of policy common sense. And I'm referring, of course, to state aid, which began as an issue of school toilet blocks in Goulburn and mushroomed into issues of state aid for independent, mainly Catholic schools. North West Cape was still there in the election of December that year, and it happened just a few weeks after Jack Kennedy's assassination, which caused people to look for stability and elevated national security even further. Federal Labor was misreading these circumstances and had been misreading these circumstances ever since the split of 1954, which Dr. Evatt really brought on the party in terms of a war with the industrial groups, the movement, and BA Santa Maria. Now, Senator Doug McClelland, who from memory is now 97, and I saw him just very recently, he may be on a walker, but his mind is incredibly sharp. And he was talking to me in terms of the tensions that existed between the New South Wales ALP of the time and the Victorian ALP, and how this had caused repeated internal arguments and really was one of the primary factors in the split. Circumstances being what they should have been, there is an argument that if the split had not occurred, federal Labor would have won the election of 54, of 61 and 69. Indeed, Mick Young, who was Federal Secretary of the ALP in 1969, said to me once, talking campaign strategy, that the strategy in 1969 for Gough Whitlam, the Federal Labor Party, was to win in 2 elections. It was a band of seats to win in 69, a further band of seats to win in 72. And he said to me, mate, if I'd known how close we'd go against John Gorton, we'd have tried to win in 1. Now, in 1961, as we know, the closeness of the result, Killen always said it was a drift of Communist Party preferences. That's nonsense, of course. It was simply DLP preferences coming through. So 54, the split, Dr. Evatt, federal Labor is making extraordinary mistakes almost continuously. This is a gift for the Menzies government. It's like playing a game of AFL where your opponents are playing rugby league. I mean, that was the political circumstance. Compound that with the circumstance of Labor leaders staying too long. In Evatt's case, 4 losses, Cornwall's case, 3 losses. Ladies and gentlemen, the electorate doesn't wait that long to make up its mind about you. They didn't in the 1950s. David's nodding, he knows the score. They didn't in the 1950s and 60s. They don't now. You will be judged, quite possibly on your first effort, certainly in 2. So the circumstances were that federal Labor, until Gough Whitlam, began an internal reform and then launched a series of contemporary policies, was very much in the desert. I'll tell a story that astounded me at the time. but I think is absolutely on the money. It's December of 1989. I'm a guest of Wayne Swan, the ALP tally room in Brisbane, which is in the overall Queensland state tally room. Labor wins for the first time since 1957. Wayne Goss leads Labor back. Russell Cooper, the then Premier, concedes honourably. Wayne Goss comes to the microphone and accepts victory honourably. I was standing next to Laurie Oakes, who remains a friend, and I said, you know, as Russell Cooper left tonight, it reminded me of that extraordinary line from Jonathan Swift about the pale ghost retreating. And he looked at me and said, what are you thinking? I said, it wasn't the ghost of Sir Joe, it was the ghost of Vince Gare. Later on in conversation with Kevin Rudd, I said the same thing to him. And straight away, Kevin said, yes, tonight is the end of the split. Which is extraordinary when you think about it, from 1957 to 1989, in a polity as important as the state of Queensland. So the mistakes that were made in that long period in the desert had astonishing consequences. And the point is this: Sir Robert Menzies was an extraordinarily gifted parliamentarian and strategist, and he read the Australian electorate with a very keen eye. With the exception of 1961, he understood. And he had learned that in opposition, painfully in opposition, just as John Winston Howard had learned. You could make the argument that to an extent, Bob Hawke had learned by being rejected by the Parliamentary Labor Party and having to come into the centre to win the leadership from Bill Hayden. But my assessment of Menzies over a long period of time accords with that of Clive James in his review of Troy Bramston's excellent book on Menzies. I'm indebted to Troy Bramston for today, as I am to John Howard for the Menzies era. They're both extraordinarily enjoyable accounts of the Menzies years. And James said, Menzies had his faults, but his virtues are the bedrock of our inheritance. You could make that comment about some other prime ministers, Deakin and Fisher perhaps, Curtin and Chifley, Howard, but it certainly applies to Sir Robert Menzies. I thank you for your courtesy today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Zach. Yes, I'm bringing up the rear, so thank you very much for sticking around. Yes, I'd like to begin by acknowledging Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, as well as Ngunnawal and Ngambri, where I come from, Canberra. Thank you again to Georgina, to Josh, Christina, David. It's been a fantastic conference again, and what a privilege to be involved. And I'd also just like to begin by acknowledging Matilda Hatcher, who contributed to some of the research, particularly on the media stuff, and who will eventually co-author the written paper. Now, especially within and around the modern Liberal Party, as we heard from Charles Richardson actually, Menzies is a figure on which a wide range of ideological positions and policy preferences have been projected, I think, since his retirement, particularly since his death, I think. What I want to do today is take a snapshot, however blurred, of a moment of intense arguments about his legacy, but one as unaffected by the last 60 years of history as I can manage, and one that I hope will be largely free of the effort to mobilise Menzies symbolically in the decades since his retirement. So what I'm going to do is to examine reaction to Menzies' retirement in early 1966, largely domestic reaction, although, of course, his retirement received notice and commentary right around the world. And I draw on two kinds of material here, print media sources and letters written to Menzies on his retirement. I'll show that some of the impressions that exist in the historical literature about how
Australians regarded Menzies by 1966 as a remnant of another age, in the present but also somehow out of it, are belied by this material, particularly the letters, I think. Opinions were more diverse, and there are silences too that need to be interpreted, and I'll do that very briefly as best I can. Now, the most famous treatment from the era itself of Menzies as a kind of anachronism comes from Donald Horne's The Lucky Country. Although Horne was at this time still much closer to the Liberals than to any other party, Menzies operates in the book as a metonym for Horne's wider argument about the elite riding on its luck and out of touch with the modern world. The Lucky Country was published in December 1964, so just a little bit, little more than a year before Menzies' retirement. And my first question really is whether Horne's analysis was echoed in print media coverage. And the answer that I'll provide is that it was in a good deal of that coverage, but in less polemical and I think more qualified terms than we find with Horne. Rupert Murdoch's The Australian, which was then in its infancy, is one place to start, although it needs to be kept in mind that it was not widely representative of media or public opinion. Has anything happened to Australia in the last 16 years of which we can say this was Menzies? It asked. It offered education as one answer. I'll continue with the quote. Perhaps when the history books are in writing, we shall find that his real achievements have been almost entirely political. Here was a theme, I think, that would echo throughout the commentary, that Menzies had, and again I'm quoting from The Australian, the Midas touch, his fantastic run of success since 1949, his unerring political touch, his judgment of the right moments, his talent for survival, his overpowering domination of politics, unquote. Now, another theme in this commentary was that Menzies was a pragmatist who'd been willing, when he felt that it was required, to adopt the policies of the Labor opposition and treat them as if they were his own. The Australian thought Menzies had held the country back from all that it could be. Again, I quote, "The result of the past 16 years is that while Sir Robert presided over us so well and achieved so much personally, it can't be said that Australia has emerged as a notable pace setter in any field of human activity." Now, another of the era's modernising newspapers, the Australian Financial Review, was also more impressed, I think, by Menzies' mastery of the art of politics, the superb political nous, that's the phrase of the AFR, the superb political nous that had produced that long string of election victories, rather than by any wider legacy. Again, I quote, "If the art of politics is to win elections, his performance over the years has been one of the world's masterpieces, but his total achievements, however, may be judged against a much broader canvas and may look more modest as a result." Menzies, it thought, was usually able to foresee, and I'm quoting here, was usually able to foresee or isolate problems with all the clarity of a first-class legal mind. It was the solutions which so frequently eluded him. The parochial politician took precedence over the statesman. The sentimentalist smothered the logician, unquote. Now, in the accounts of the Australian and AFR, we have most of the elements of what I'll call here the more critical treatment of Menzies in the public sources. And there you have them. That he'd mastered politics, the arts of oratory, political tactics, winning elections, but had achieved less of substance with those talents than he should have. Secondly, the argument went, he cleverly adopted policies often associated with Labor, which were a great distance from the free enterprise message that had helped get him into office in the first place. Thirdly, he'd failed to come to grips with the region that would be most important to Australia's future, Asia. And fourthly, that he was out of tune with the directions and possibilities of the era, which was seen as a result of his old-fashioned preoccupation with Britishness or the British Empire. So I think that broadly sums up the 4 key points of criticism you get from, I suppose, what we might call the more progressive or liberal in the small L sense leaning newspapers. Now, the point I want to make here is that actually you find strands of this sort of critique in the media more generally, or at least the print media more generally in the period. It isn't confined to, I think, rather unrepresentative papers such as the Australian and the AFR. Geoffrey Tebbit, for instance, a real veteran, writing in the Melbourne Herald, considered, and I quote, "It was in the field of foreign policy that his judgments were most likely to be faulty or to be assailed. Munich, Suez, and what at one stage seemed to be an excessive tenderness for the South African government in its apartheid policy," unquote. Yet such judgments were also leavened, I think, by a sense that Menzies had left behind him, again I quote from the Western Australian, "an immensely stronger and more confident nation." Overwhelmingly, in the more positive elements of print media coverage, Menzies was seen to have conformed with what most Australians expected of a Prime Minister. He'd pursued middle-of-the-road policies, and that term middle of the road keeps coming up. He had, said the Australian, provided, and I quote, "provided a stable climate in which Australia could grow, sheltered from without by his efforts to ensure that we would be covered by the security shield of the United States and nurtured at home by policies that met the wishes of most people." And the building of universities and of Canberra were often mentioned as notable achievements in those more positive elements of the media, the print media commentary. That's all I'm going to say on that now, not because I don't have vast amounts of material, but because of time. So I want to move on now to look at some of those private writings, those letters written to Menzies. And they survive in 3 archival boxes in the National Library in Menzies' papers. Now, as with the print media coverage, I can do no more here than provide their flavour. Menzies wrote to Lord Carrington that, I quote, "the Australian press was on the whole generous, but the people, or the thousands who have written to us, are as good as gold." But the letters came in from home and abroad, and I'll be concentrating here again on the domestic side. They came from the illustrious and the unknown, from friends and strangers, from committed Liberal Party members, as well as the less partisan, including those who said they voted Labor, from young, old and middle age. There's some from young people. More than press commentary, they give us an insight into women's perspectives. And of course, they conform to the genre of this kind of letter. The letter's written on or after the 20th of January, sometimes straight after the correspondent had viewed the final press conference on the television, characteristically expressed regret at his decision, understanding about why he'd made that decision, gratitude for his service, and good wishes for his retirement. It gets a little tedious after a while, it has to be said. It's a striking feature, though, of the letters written to Menzies through his prime ministership, and I've looked at many more, not just the retirement ones. Martin Lyons, of course, has produced a detailed study of those. They give the impression, I think, of a citizenry that believed politics to be working. They believed politics to be working. It was amenable to their democratic influence. They recognised an outgoing prime minister who had served them and who had ruled with their consent. I think it's a really strong theme. Sometimes the letters are adoring, but they can also be thoughtful and reflective. The overwhelming impression they leave is that Menzies, again, he conformed to many Australians' perceptions of what a Prime Minister should be. Violet Braddon of Woollahra wrote to Dame Patty, complimenting her and her husband for the magnificent image you have given this country at home and abroad. Menzies was even credited with the common touch, a far cry, I think, from the more aloof patrician image of collective memory. One of my greatest thrills in these last weeks is to realise the sadness and the affection for you of the man in the street, wrote one of them. If I may endeavour to speak for the ordinary bloke, I can assure you, sir, he feels he has lost his greatest leader and cobber. Now, it doesn't sound like Menzies to me, But I think it's worth keeping in mind, this is a fragment of the mid-60s. Tastes in political leaders have shifted over the decades that followed. They were seeking in Menzies neither a larrikin nor a daggy dad. One correspondent thought she was losing someone she, and I quote, considered my dearest friend. Modern media, radio, television, were surely critical here, bringing the voice and image of Menzies directly into people's homes. A woman from the Melbourne suburb of Doncaster reported, "I will miss your voice coming over the air." Such simple words, but so convincing. Voice mattered, but so did bearing. Dora E. Cawthorne, "My greatest compliment to you, dear Sir Robert, is that my eyes were very moist as I watched you walk so stately up the steps of Parliament House, Canberra." This is the TV coverage, of course. Now, these correspondents identified Australia's prosperous condition and the improvements that they'd seen in their lives since the war with Menzies' long reign. They did not imagine, as Horne did, that Menzies had merely presided. The owner of a country car dealership was certain that it was to the federal sphere and not the state that one needed to look to explain the nation's present happy condition. We in New South Wales have suffered even longer years from a self-seeking party of what I always considered no-hopers. And had we had the misfortune not to have had you to counterbalance their effects, I shudder to think what our position would be today. For Peter Aldred of Vaucluse, founder of the construction supply company Cement Aid, Menzies was the grand architect of a country that had grown in leaps and bounds. My children and my children's children will be better for your building. You were the vigorous architect through the period of our country's most astounding growth. You were our trusted architect who built well and faithfully, who perceived a greater future, enlarged the foundations, and built a greater edifice. To reinforce the point, he sent Menzies a translation of the Roman engineer, architect, and author Vitruvius, another great architect, explained Aldred. Victoria Hallahan from Panania said she was, "I am writing as an ordinary housewife and mother. You have given us everything we have today. The best of them is happiness. When I say happiness, I mean just that. For 17 years, you have given us employment and good wages, and without these things, we could not have happiness. As in most families, if there is a shortage of money, there are arguments and quarrels as to where the money went, both parties blaming each other. But since you have been our leader, this has not been the case. So on behalf of my husband and 2 young children, I would like to say thank you, Sir Robert." In such ways, Menzies' achievements were seen to have reached deeply into private life. Veronica added, "My husband John has a very clear memory of you walking in Dean Street, Albury, one Sunday morning in December 1944, and says that you appeared to really enjoy that after-breakfast cigar." Now, in his reply, and many of the replies are there to these letters, Menzies informed her that Mr. Hallahan had stumbled on a moment that mattered, of course, the Liberal Party's famous Albury conference, where, and he explained, "we set the foundation solidly for the building of the new party. A lot has happened since then, but I'm able to look back to that weekend with satisfaction because what was accomplished at that time now enables my wife and me to go out of political life with self-respect in our minds and happiness in our hearts." Correspondents could credit Menzies for the most unlikely happenings in their lives. Sylvia Bullivant from Auburn reported that her daughter Kerry had just matriculated and gained a Commonwealth scholarship to study pharmacy at the University of Sydney. "I would like you to accept my very sincere thanks for any assistance you may have given in this matter." Undoubtedly, the government scholarship scheme, as we heard yesterday, and the expansion of the university system in the wake of the Murray report had opened opportunities for people like Kerry, but her mother implies, I think, some more personal connection, as if Menzies were overseeing the process of selection himself. Frances Elizabeth Bradford, seeing out her last years in the Louvre and Rest Home at Albury, reflected, "This is quite a pleasant place to spend the evening of one's life, and thanks to the pension, one can afford it. I sometimes wonder what we would do without it. I am an ex-nurse and feel I did not make wise use of my time and savings. However, a benevolent government came to our rescue, though I am a pensioner." A benevolent government. I think that captured it for many of these people. Marie Burns, a young married woman, wrote on behalf of her family, "All my voting life, you have been Prime Minister, and I have never known any real hardship. Our children are growing up in a secure feeling of a well-respected country in the world where so many countries are in turmoil. For this, I thank your wise management over the years." Australia's reputation in the world mattered to many of these correspondents who made frequent reference to the Commonwealth of Nations. Menzies himself, as we heard today, might have been a rather disgruntled gentleman with the Commonwealth that was something other now than a white man's club, but many Australians still regarded their country's place in the world through the Commonwealth lens, with, of course, the Queen presiding as its head, a role that she combined with that of Australia's sovereign. And here, of course, Menzies was also seen to have shone. "Your loyalty to our beloved Queen has been a source of pleasure to many of us," said one. Comparisons with Winston Churchill, who'd of course died only the year before, were very common in the letters that I've read so far. So to finish, what are the silences? While there are references in press material to the progress of Papua New Guinea, the experience of First Nation peoples does not figure at all. Their treatment at the hands of those testing atomic bombs on their country and those handing over their land to mining companies, which is happening by the 60s, would only later, I think, figure in reflection on Menzies' reputation and legacy. Surprisingly, in view of its prominence in our own times, housing is not specifically much mentioned in any of the letters or indeed the press coverage that I've seen so far, perhaps being swept up in a general sense of affluence. The extent of poverty among many Australians who'd missed the bus on the affluent society figured in neither public nor private writings that I've seen so far. And needless to say, media commentators and correspondents did not bemoan the fact that he'd failed to dismantle, protection or arbitration or any of that sort of thing, or white Australia. It would be much more accurate, I think, to see or to suggest that Menzies was seen to somehow embody those things more than to be kind of a thwarted reformer. There's certainly no sense of that in reflection on his retirement. Now, of course, affluence could no longer be taken for granted just a few years later. With the end of the long boom, Menzies' reputation would then become more contested. And of course, the impact of the Vietnam War was important here, as well as new social and political movements. My snapshot has really sought to capture a moment of lamentation as well as celebration among many Australians who, having emerged from about half a century of depression and war, could hardly believe their comfortable plenty. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.